approach comes from all the partners knowing what their role is and working on that. So it's not so much pooling resources. We don't put the funds into a central kitty and then draw money out, but we know that our commitment and our share contributes to the overall picture. And I think that's an incredible advantage of you then have multiple players all working together with the one plan and bringing our own resources and skills to bear in the plan.
I think that was right.
Yeah.
Can we say hello?
You want to respond?
Hello.
Okay, we can hear you.
Okay.
We can hear you.
I would pose it as a question, but in the case of the Tasmanian devil, putting them in secure, confined conditions was the only way to get disease-free animals away from diseased ones. And that is completely different from the reaction of when it's endangered in the wild, put into captivity. We put it in a zoo and one day it may go back to the wild. Okay, under both conditions they're under confined conditions, under captive breeding and management, but conceptually they are psychologically totally different. And I think we're going to see far more of the Tasmanian devil situation where animals are taken into, if you like, protective custody for relatively short periods of time while a specific problem in the wild is overcome, and then they go back again. And it needs the techniques of the zookeeping world without a lot of the mentality and psychology of zoos. And I think the public should start to understand this.
Carolyn, I think we can hear you. Can you say something to make sure that we can hear you?
Yes, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear what's happening in the room, but only very faintly, actually.
Okay. So we have down here question.
Again, to the resource problem. Most of the time, the situation which we are facing is not we have a single species which is on the red list, we want to save it, and then we are trying to get all the partners to do a joint plan. The situation usually is that we have lots of species and we have to decide which are we going to invest in. So how can we tell or assess if which of the species are kind of on the lag phase in which probably might in 20, 30 years time get extinct because they're what we call the living dead, and how can we decide who are the species which has the highest percentage of success in order to invest in these species.
Have you got a specific situation in mind? I mean, are we talking about communities of plants or invertebrates, or is this a general question?
If you look at the countries with high development pressures.
If you look at countries with high development pressures, you got massive destruction of habitats, and then you have fragmentation and habitat loss, etc. And you have many species which are about to on the verge of extinction, and you have limited resources. Now the question is, how do you choose the one species in which you put your resources on, and hopefully it's the species that has or a few species that has the highest probability of getting saved, on contrary to species which, unfortunately, with the limited resources that usually conservation has, we might want to at this stage, maybe not invest in them.
Well, clearly the more species you can combine into one planning meeting, the greater the cost effectiveness. And if you look at all the regional plans in Africa for cheetah and wild dog, they're done together because they face very similar threats. So you're getting two to the price of one. Obviously, the more species you include, you may run the risk of being a bit superficial and not getting really detailed data, but that's a separate issue. But as a real example, there was a plan done for a river system in Brazil on the freshwater fish. And it had a very high level of endemic species, some of which were known to be in trouble. And they probably didn't have the data to plan for every single species, and it really wasn't necessary. So they strategized and chose a selection of species of different habits, different needs, living in different bits of the river, and they planned for them, I guess in the hope, but it was an argued hope, that it would then help all the species in the river. And they implemented it very largely, and the follow-up after 1 year looks as if that approach has worked. And I think we could do the same with plant communities as well.
Thanks. And also, one of the things is that this sort of species planning isn't the only way to save species. So if this is done in combination with habitat protection as well, so if you get a really good system of protected areas, and that's going to take care of most of your species if it's well planned. And so then what the species planning needs to do is, in a sense, in terms of with scarce resources, look at what's falling through the cracks with that. So that would tend to be species that are either incredibly wide-ranging, and so that the protected area system isn't sufficient, or which are faced by particular, sometimes species-specific threats, such as very high targeted hunting of that species, or disease like the Tasmanian devil for that species. So if these two things are done in combination, if you do that, and with a lot of your landscape planning for protected area stuff, that picks up on a whole bunch of very different types of donors and resources. So if those two are done hand in hand, then that picks up on if you're talking about a tropical rainforest, that picks up on tens of thousands more species at a stroke.
Also with the swordfishes, so there are 7 species in 80 countries, and we had to try and work out whether we were going to start doing global actions or more focused regional actions. And so we went with the global level, but we now have a network of over 140 people, and so we're actually looking to find regional champions that then take on a regional conservation strategy for swordfishes, and they can start doing more focused actions. And I think one of those, as Mark said, would be sort of habitat protection. They're present in mangroves and estuaries, and so I think on a regional level people can start focusing in on those areas of protection.
Can I just add, I wouldn't give up on species, so even if your vortex model shows these beasts are going to be extinct in 20 years' time, most of them are bloody resilient, really. So don't give up on them. Try to fundraise for them and try to get them over that crisis. We have a lemur species in northern sportive lemur where we know we have 18 left. And we won't give up on it. We will try to get them through there, even if we have to collect them all from the last remaining forest fragment and have to breed them in captivity until we have 200 again. There will be some of them left. So.
The question was about prioritization, and we've heard many really wonderful examples over the last few days about prioritization schemes. And yesterday and then again today there were sessions on the Alliance for Zero Extinction approach. And I think that that's something that if you are concerned about how to make decisions, rather than coming up with some kind of new approach for prioritization, there are some really nice ones out there. If you look at the Alliance for Zero Extinction, if there's a site in your area, you can do some kind of planning for that AZE site, and you're then making a plan for the trigger species, whatever that was, and the other species that are in that area, many of which are also at risk. So I think that just looking at other kinds of existing prioritization schemes can be really helpful. Carolyn?
Let me ask you a question, Carolyn. Can you hear me, Carolyn?
Yes.
One of the questions that we were grappling with before was how do you balance different institutional partners? And you've been very involved in a direct case of that. Did you find that the planning process was seamless, or were there differences in perspectives from the different stakeholders?
It certainly wasn't seamless, and I think that there are so many stakeholders in the Devil program that there have been all sorts of tensions at various times. But I think that that having enough people in place whose job it is to check in with the stakeholders regularly is really important, and to feel that that's a really important part of the project, and to have everyone understand that that's a really important part of the project is really valuable. And also having those regular fora where people really can come together and listen to what everybody's been working on, so that you don't get, so nobody has the sense there's a lot of stuff going on that they don't know about, especially when various partners are investing enormous amounts of money in some cases. I think that that's really important. And it's certainly not perfect in the Devil program, but that is a very large, very highly politically charged project, and I think given that, it's actually gone extremely well and continues to go extremely well because they've really been paying attention to the stakeholder component.
Thank you.
I had a very different question coming back to Elizabeth's proposal. Really, one would be a kind of example where you would see conservation, the examples that would be on the far right of the, is that the wrong way? Anyway, they're really good conservation examples. And then the opposite of extinction seems to me to be thriving rather than conserved. And that seems like a very different way of looking at it. But the challenge being often what's thriving is the wrong things. So rats and seagulls and invasive species like rabbits and toads. And how one would deal with that sort of extreme being the other side of the coin of the red list.
That's a very good thought. And in fact, when we were writing that bioscience paper in the first place, we said, well, do we go beyond that to pests? And we actually stopped at fully conserved. But that's right. And there is another whole realm out there of things that you actually don't want around because they're alien invasives or because they're species such as, well, where I'm in the eastern US, white-tailed deer, where there's no predators and they've essentially become a garden pest, much though I love them. So yes, somehow the system at the moment is not taking that into account, but a really well-developed system should actually take those sort of unwanted extra species into account as well. I don't know how to do it, but it needs to be included.
And the great examples of conserved?
Great examples of conserved. A peregrine falcon might be a good example of fully conserved, something that's basically gone from near extinct to right along till the fact that they're nesting on buildings and doing very well around the world.
Do we have to agree amongst ourselves on a panel? Good, fine. I had slight trouble with the scheme as well, and didn't have time to come back at you, because I think Jen's point is right, and to be fully conserved implies action to conserve it, whereas if you said conservation secure, it doesn't actually tell you how it's been done. Because I think you then want another axis that says, well, is it conservation secure as a result of any activity or not? And then, of course, you can have your pests because they're over-secure by our standards, and you may get them to do something. So I think I'm all in favour of the green list, but I think the terminology is actually very critical to get the right sense.
Yes, no, I absolutely agree. And the other thing is, it's supposed to be independent of how it got. Sorry, it's supposed to be independent of how it got there. I can't. I told you out of the side of my ear. It's supposed to be independent of how it got there, in a sense. It's a description of the state of the species, which is what the red list does as well. It's a description of the... I can't look at it. Please stand there. It's a description of the state of the species, irrespective of how it got to that state. So some of them might never have declined in the first place, and some might, like the oryx, be sort of working its way back from the brink and working its way towards the left there. So it should be sort of independent of all those. And yes, the term should reflect that. And the other thing to bear in mind is that it's irrespective of the management needed to keep it at that place. So there was the study showing that something like 85% of all species on the endangered species list in the States, even if they get off the endangered species list, they will remain conservation dependent. Because a lot of large animals in today's world are not going to survive unless they have some sort of active management. But again, that's independent of what their status is how they maintain there. But again, you're absolutely right, the term needs to reflect that.
I have a number of comments and also one question to the panel. The comments you said about the vortex is quite right, because there was a pink pigeon which was, according to the vortex, I think in '92, was meant to have gone extinct by 2000. But then it depends on what actions you take from them when you can bring it back up, and which is exactly what's happened. So the pink pigeon is extinct. Now, in terms of diseases, translocation of animals, I think there's a new theory, new thought on that. Actually, what a lot of veterinarians are advising is to translocate animals that have the disease, or at least have antibodies to the disease. So that the translocated population or the reintroduced population, when they do re-encounter the disease in X time, they don't disappear, or the population doesn't dwindle very quickly. So there's a new thought on this, as in you translocate populations with the diseases and you don't translocate totally clean animals. And the question which I wanted to ask the panel also was, what is the position in terms of analog species reintroductions? So in cases where you don't have the species anymore, but you use something similar, or an ecological replacement, or rewilding, as you probably call it in the US.
Caroline, did you hear the comment just now about translocating diseased animals rather than translocating disease-free animals? Did you get that? Caroline, can you still hear us?
Just faintly, just faint. Sorry, was that a question? Sorry.
Okay, there was a comment just now from the audience that there are some instances where deliberately diseased animals were translocated rather than disease-free animals, or at least animals that already had the antibodies against the disease. Do you want to comment anything? Do you want to say anything about that from the Tasmanian Devil's point of view?
I'm sorry, was this in the context of Tasmanian Devils, or was this?
No, that was a general comment that in some instances this has been done and been thought at least to be better than translocating disease-free animals, so that these animals are already have had some exposure to something.
Yeah, I think in the case, this isn't my area at all, but in the case of the Tasmanian devil, there isn't, there's no comparable disease response that you could consider in that case. There are no antibodies to that particular disease because it's a cancer. So if you translocate animals that have any component of the disease, essentially they will develop clinical symptoms and die of it. So there would be no advantage in that case to moving anything other than animals that you'd be absolutely confident is disease free.
Okay, thank you very much, Caroline. And then who wants to? Yeah.
Thanks, Vikesh. You had a lot of complex questions there, and I know the situation you're referring to, of course. There happens by chance to be a new set of IUCN guidelines this very week on conservation and other translocations, which I've been working on for 2 years. And they deal with exactly the situation of, if you are translocating a species, logically you should take the species associated with it. And of course that includes predators or parasites and disease. Now of course that's a very tricky question. And the answer largely depends on, well, what is the risk of that parasite or disease getting out into other species or into conspecifics if they've not already got it at the destination site. It's a very complex question, that, and it's probably best done answered case by case. But you do have to start off from the position that it's actually probably impossible ever to get an animal that is disease-free to move from A to B. And if it is disease-free because it's never faced any challenge, it's probably not going to survive at the other end. So it's a very tricky one. And there is also a new disease risk assessment coming out from IUCN, from the Wildlife Health Specialist Group and others, and CBSG, and that's going to be read in the next few months, which will deal with much more detail about precisely those issues.
Can I have a go at the the second half of the question. For the idea of translocating essentially a non-native species into an area where one has gone extinct, it's a very interesting question. It's one that we've just sort of started to talk about a little bit at WCS in relation to some of the megapodes, for example. So there's islands in the South Pacific where their native megapodes have gone, they've gone extinct. There are other megapodes that are critically endangered that could do with more space. And so if they're ecologically equivalent, it's a very interesting debate whether they should be translocated there. I personally think it would be probably worth a try because you're recreating that ecological role and therefore in a sense restoring some former systems while helping yet another megapode species not to drop off the twig. But it's a very interesting debate.
Vikash has direct experience of such an ecological replacement or an analogue with the Aldabra tortoises onto the island of Mauritius. I mean, would you like to say the argument of why they were done and have they had the desired ecological impact?
Yes, in the Mascarenes, Mauritius, Reunion retreats, there are native tortoises, endemic tortoises.